Okay, so let's look at various ways to do process diagrams that illustrate how we actually get to this final landform. It's kind of good to see how those creations go through that process because there's a lot of different variation. It creates a nice narrative as well for your landforms. So again, we're starting with just the simple script that created a landform from this image. So we again want to work sequentially from one process to the next. And the first thing again was we created this from an image. So if we think about this, we probably want to first show that image as part of this process. So I'm just going to minimize this for now. And we want to set up a layering of our objects to kind of make life a little bit easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new sublayer and call this image. I'll create another one. So once I get into the sublayer, I can just create a new layer from that. And this next one I'll use as grid. Next one I'll do elevated grid. And the next one I'll do wireframe. And I'll just give them all some unique colors so it's easier to identify them. Oops. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so this first one, I have my image, so I'm going to go ahead and type picture frame. I'm going to find that image that I used. So in this case, it's this image. Open, and again, I can use this initial one as my reference. And again, I'll see if rendered, it's laying there somewhere. There we go. So let's go ahead and just move that over to that side. So here's the first part of that process, is just the image. The next thing is we want to talk about is just kind of our grid system that we're using to create that. So now we can kind of sequentially go through this process. And if I turn on the grid here, you can see that I use a pretty dense grid system, and you can probably imagine this being very difficult to visualize in Illustrator for this process. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just kind of reduce that down to get the basic idea. So maybe it's something closer to this value. So again, it's difficult to visualize points with Illustrator, so for this we just want to assign some type of geometry to represent these points. So I'm just going to stick with a simple curve, use a circle, so I can plug this into here, and I can see what that radius looks like. So this is set to default of 1, so let's try something a little bit smaller. Turn the preview on and off. So this starts to give us a better representation of it. Like I said, if you were to do it in that higher range, it's going to start to be very difficult to read. So I'm just going to stick with something around that 16 value, because I think that gives us still a good density. So this is where I'm going to, again, start to bake these onto their respective layers. So in this case, this is our grid layer. Hit OK. So then the next thing we did was we basically moved these points to those respective elevations from the image. So again, I can just copy and paste this. And now I'm using these new points. So that way, again, we're staying consistent. So I can see there's the original ones. I've also got these new elevated ones. And so something else we might want to show, instead of just having them at their different heights, maybe we also want to indicate that they moved different heights. So another kind of visualization, because it might be a little difficult to understand what those elevations were. And so what we can do is create a simple line that goes from the original points, which was here, and our new points. So now I've got some curves associated with that. So I can, again, turn this off so I can see it a little bit better, right? And so again, every time we have a different type of object, it's good to have them on separate layers. So with this elevated grid, I'll again create some sublayers. So this will be points. Create a new layer and call this direction. So I've got these curves representing my points. Now I've got these lines representing the direction. And it's actually easy to do in Illustrator by adding arrows as those endpoints. Okay, so now I can turn that off. You can start to see how these begin to look. Again, I'm going to give them a slightly different color, just so it's easier to actually select in Illustrator. Again, and the layers are going to come in, but it's easy to do it by colors as well. So now I've got that. Now the next thing I want to do is represent my surface, right? So it's going to be difficult to show an actual surface in Illustrator. So that's why I've named this wireframe, because even though we are going to bake this onto that layer, I actually want to see it a little bit differently. So what I'm actually going to do, so let's select this, and I'm actually, because I can see that again, like the interpolation of this is a little bit off, so maybe I just want to kind of elevate it a little bit more so it's a little bit more representative of it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just make it so it looks pretty evident. So again, it's hard to see this in Illustrator, but what I can do is show it as a wireframe. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go to, make sure I'm on that active layer. I'm going to go to Curve, Curve from Objects, and Extract Wireframe. So it's actually got that selected. It doesn't look like anything changed, but if I look at the properties, it says 46 open curves. Now I can actually delete the surface. We can start to see how we start to create these diagrams. So from here, I want to actually begin to lay them out into their respective sections. So what I'm going to do now is, again, I've got my image actually separated. Now I can select the grid, so select objects. I'm just going to start to move them over. It really doesn't matter right now because I'll organize them in Illustrator a little bit better. So in this case, because I have sublayers, I'm going to say select sublayer objects. Move those over. Now I can select my wireframe and move that over. And I'll just go ahead and hide this for now. So now I've got my 4 processes. I'm going to go ahead and select them, or let's actually make them into a proper kind of view. So I'm going to right-click. Oops, I'm going to go up here, say Set View to some type of isometric view. In this case, probably going to be looking from the southeast. And now that I've got an isometric view, I can always angle it to be a little bit better because, again, if it's too skewed, it's going to be hard to see that image. So maybe I want to do something a little bit more like that. And again, it doesn't matter how it gets laid out here. I'll do the majority of that actually in Illustrator. So now that I'm more or less happy with this, I'll go ahead and select everything, type Export. Go to where I want to save these. I want to do it as an Adobe Illustrator file. So I'll do Rhino, export, Heightfields. Go ahead and hit save. This all looks fine. I don't really care about the export boundary. So now I'll just hit OK. All right, so now let's actually do some post-processing in Illustrator and editing this. And again, what's great about this is that it's all vector work, so it really doesn't matter what size we start off at. I will at least orientate it to landscape because these are going to go in a sequential order. So let's go ahead and create it that way. And now I can go to File, Open. Go to that file, so there's the Illustrator. And I can work within this, or I can bring it into my new file. So what's good about this is that it's already kind of layered. So it doesn't really matter, it's kind of up to you. But we can start to see that now we've got all our different things. And this is why I still created a different color for those lines, because you can see that although, actually I did bring them in, just instead of sublayers, it's just got them as their own separate layer, which is fine. So what's interesting is, again, that image was built from a surface essentially with a material assigned to it. So that's actually not going to come in as an image. However, we can still apply it in Illustrator by doing some distortion of it. So I'm going to go to File, Place. I'll find, again, that same image that I used in the script. And I'm just going to go ahead and place it at least somewhere within that same proportion. And I'll go ahead and put it on its respective layer. So it's a little bit difficult to do any transforming on like Photoshop, where I can't just grab these anchor points and move them to those corners. But what I can do is in envelope transformation. You'll see if I go to Object, Envelope, Distort, and this will give me the ability to do that. So the first thing I need to do is actually embed this image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Embed. Now I'm going to go to Object, Envelope, Distort, and I'm going to choose Make with Mesh. And you want to set your rows to 1 by 1. That way you're really just kind of messing with the corners here. If you have multiple rows, if I turn on Preview, you'll start to see that every time you make this distortion, you're really only going to be editing this single cell, and then everything else is going to stay the same. So by dropping that all the way to 1 for each, then it's just going to treat this image as one cell. And that'll make the transformation easier. So I'm going to hit OK now. Now what's great is I can actually use the quick select, so this white arrow. So I just hit A on my keyboard to go to that. So I can start to move these to match these corners. Well, you'll see that it is still kind of in this weird kind of curving distortion, which is okay for now because I'll edit that, but what I want to do is at least match those corners. And what I can do with this quick selection tool is also grab these handles and just drag them to their corners. And you'll see that now it starts to kind of conform to the actual rectangle itself. Oops. You have to be careful when you're selecting them that you're actually selecting the handle. So make sure you want to click and hold and drag that. So didn't really specify it before, but again, you just want to, when it says handle, click, hold, and drag it down. Click, hold, and drag it to that corner. You'll see that it will want to snap to it, so that helps you. Now I just have to, there's that handle, so now I've got it matching that same thing. Perfect. So I can go ahead and actually get rid of that boundary, or I can assign it just as a separate color. So actually maybe I'll do it that way. So let's do arrange. So I'll just go ahead and click and drag and hold shift to deselect the image. So now I just have the stroke. And now I'll just reduce that by a little bit. Change the color. Where is the... So with the CC, you can obviously start to generate different libraries of colors, images, and stuff. So it kind of helps keep things consistent if you know you're going to use things throughout. So now I just have a nice boundary for this. So something you might want to do now is begin to, again, kind of show that order of operations. So I'm going to, again, select now my grid. I want to move it to actually match this. So in order to do that, I want to use some guides to help me. I'm going to hit Control R to turn on my rulers here. So you'll see that now I've got that kind of in my workspace. And now I can just click, hold, and drag this down to snap to that corner. And now when I apply this, I can again grab that corner and have it snap to that ruler. So now everything starts to line up nicely. And again, I want to edit this. It's not the layer color, so I'm going to hit Shift X to convert these. It looks like they're actual fills, but if I change them, they're actually strokes. I'm just going to hit Shift X. And again, I'm going to apply the same color. So now I have a grid of points representing that. And so I'm going to, again, kind of go through the same process. So the next thing I want to do is select both these objects, so the circles as well as the lines. So I've got those, they're on separate layers. If I want to select both layers, I can hold Shift and click these circles, so now I've got both of those selected. And I'm going to move that again to, I'll be a little bit more meticulous about that to make sure that they actually match. Again, I'm not even really worried about this distance yet because I can take care of that at the end. But again, I want to keep things consistent. So there's the actual circles themselves, which I probably want them to match that. So I'll just use the eyedropper, select it, and you can see that they're behind it. So I want to actually drag that layer to be on top. And now I've got my line work. And again, I want to stay consistent with that. So I'm going to, again, I'll eyedrop it for the color, hit Shift X to convert them to strokes, and make them much thinner. So let's see what happens if I drop them down to 1/4 of a point. Still kind of thick. So let's try, at least for now, 0.1. Looks a little better. So I'm going to again select those, and I want to indicate that these were created with arrows, so to indicate some movement. So I can go to my stroke window. If I don't have it already there, I can go to Window and choose Stroke there. You can see that I have arrowheads. And Illustrator is pretty smart of knowing that I created these curves from their original kind of planar grid of points and move them up. So it actually understands that they were drawn from the start to the end. So these arrowheads, you can indicate where you want them, if you want them at the start or the end. So if I go to the right, which is the ends, I can select an arrowhead. So let's try maybe 11 to make it a little bit thinner. And then I can even start to indicate their actual size. So maybe the arrowhead's a little bit too big, so I can always decrease that. Maybe again, these arrows aren't actual part of the geometry, it's just movement. So in order to indicate something being different from an actual object versus a process, I can use a dashed line to help me communicate that. So in order to convert these to dots, I want to give it a 0 dash. And usually what I like to do is for whatever the gap is to be something like 4 times that. So let's just try 0.5 for now. And I also want to give it a round cap. So maybe these can be a little bit denser. So maybe try something like 0.3 and hit tab just to move it over. Again, you can kind of continue to mess with this. 0.2 is a little better. I'm also going to change the opacity of these for now, so I'll just drop them down to like 65 for now, just so they're a little bit lighter. Right, so now they're a little more kind of discrete, which is nice. So now I start to get that idea of movement. And again, it's looking really small, but everything will scale up, which is good. So now I'll take this last part and move it over here. And what's good is I can, again, just eyedrop this to be that same color, hit Shift X to switch from a fill to a stroke. Again, it's pretty thick, so I'm going to stick with something like 0.25. Even that seems a little bit thick for now, so I'm going to go ahead and do something like 0.1. There, that's looking better. And let's see what happens. So what's good about this is that it actually kind of in the wireframe, it understands that these are large segments, so I can actually just select the boundaries here, or the borders, and maybe I want to make those just slightly thicker, not that thick. Maybe something more like that. So now I've got my boundary line. Cool. So I think we're almost there. The one last thing I want to do, and this is where it gets kind of nitpicky, where you want to show, again, a kind of a proper sequence of changes in this. So sometimes it's always good to kind of use the previous step as a reference point. So what I can do is, again, I've got this colored image. I can Alt and copy it over and just kind of shift it to match that grid of points. And so I actually did a couple things with this. And I want to, again, kind of make it so that the image doesn't compete with the actual process of applying a grid. So I'm going to go ahead and just drop the opacity to be really light. And the other thing you might remember is that I'm not actually working from a colored image. I'm working from a black and white. So what's cool is I can actually, let's go ahead and just lock these other layers. I can even turn them off so it's a little bit easier to see. So what I can do is actually, I'll use the pen tool for now. All right. Where is it? It's a little bit different now. I think that's the same thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and, oops, nope, that is not, sorry, the latest version has changed some of these things. So I just want to use, let's try, oh, so it's, I was just covering it up. So there's the pen tool. So I'm just going to click each one of these corners and close it. So in order to actually kind of give this a grayscale, I mean, I could, I guess, go through that process of bringing in a new image that's black and white, or I can just change the blending mode of some of these things. So this is a grayscaled image or a colored fill. So what I can go is to transparency, change the blending mode to hue, or no, sorry, is it saturation? Yep, there we go. So I can change that to saturation to make that a grayscale image. And again, I could change the opacity of some of these things because I do want to keep that filled one. So I'll just select everything and then hold shift to deselect the fill. So I'll give that again a even lighter opacity. And maybe this is, and that's already pretty light. Let's see if we can make it a little bit lighter. And that's pretty much as light as can be, but yep, that should be okay for now, just so we get the idea. So you can see when I put that grid that those show up a little bit better. So it might be good to, again, kind of show the previous step overlaid in a more kind of discrete fashion. So again, now I'll select just those points, hold Alt to copy and shift them over and get them to align as closely as possible. So they were closer to like here. And again, I want to make it so that they aren't competing with everything else. So I'm just going to, again, drop the opacity to something like 15%. So I have that as a reference. And again, I'm just going to do the same thing of copying. I don't need to copy all of it. I just want to copy oops, and let's put the wireframe on top. So again, we'll just move these over. I'll keep them at the actual same height, and then I'll just take the wireframe and shift that up a little bit. So now I can, again, let's lock the wireframe, so I can just select these and change their opacity to like 25% again. So that way, again, it's kind of just helps us see that information of these moving up. Great. All right, so like I said, we want to kind of align these up nicely. So what I like to do is always select them. Let's unlock things. So there's a couple ways I can do it. I can create kind of some type of reference tool. So if I were to just kind of create a rectangle for what that spacing wants to be, so I can do something like that where I can move it over and just have it so that kind of keeps that spacing. Oops, I didn't select everything. Right, so this is an easy way just to help us serve as a nice spacing. Because we got a bunch of things on different layers, there's another way to do it, but then we'll lose our layering and other information. So again, this is just kind of a nice, easy operation, and I probably want to move some of that over, give them a little bit more spacing. So I'm just going to select this as well and just shift it over to get within that same kind of dimension. Oops, not like, there we go. So, all right, so now we've got them nice in space. I can, again, always select everything, scale it up, and let's check on something. So it looks like I've got the proper settings so that every time I scale it, that the effects will also scale with it. So it's not like it retains those. So in order to make sure that that actually occurs, you want to go to File, or sorry, Edit, Preferences in General, and make sure that you have the Scale, Strokes, and Effects selected. So if you don't, just undo it a couple times and redo it that way. And again, it doesn't really matter how big this is. So if it's something even larger, so if you're doing this on a 24 by 36 and landscape porch and landscape orientation, I can do it that way. So even with that image, it shouldn't matter. And I can start to scale this and see those a little bit better. Okay, so the next thing, again, it's always good to include some annotation for this. So I'm just gonna use the text box, and I'm not gonna create anything too difficult, but I'll just label it as something like image selection for landform from for landform, I don't know. For landform, sure, that works. I usually like to, again, kind of use my own text style, not the generic version. Again, I'll be consistent with my colors, so I'll go to window, go back to my libraries, make sure I'm, again, using the same kind of color throughout. Let's actually, instead of just doing that generic, I'm going to get rid of that for now. I can just go ahead and copy and paste this each time. So I can make sure that these things begin to line up nicely. A good kind of quick way to do that is if I select both of these objects, I can actually use my align tool. So horizontal align left will just move that image to match that corner. So creating grid of points. Again, hold Alt to make a copy, hold Shift to keep it on that orthogonal path. Again, I'll just select one of those objects, use the align left, moving point grid to designated Z elevation. And then next thing, I'm gonna just move it all the way over, grab this, say generating surface from points. All right, so that we got that. And this is, again, maybe you want to create some type of different separate labeling system. So I'll just use something like this with a circle and a text box and say 1, make it centered. Change the color to white so it pops. Change the size, maybe it's a bold. Maybe these are all italic.